Radhika, and I am the director and founder of Super School India, which is an NGO based out of New Delhi. I'm very excited to be on the fomonomore platform with Vrinda.
Hey everyone, I'm Vrinda Loiwal.
Join me for my 7-part series with fomonomore. See you there.
Hello everyone, good evening. My name is Vrinda Loiwal and I'm from India. I run the Center for Social Emotional Learning, which is a learning design company for learners of all types, all kinds, all ages. And we focus on building social and emotional skills. I welcome you here today on FOMO No More. If you've just joined us, make sure you click the like button so that you get regular updates. There's lots of great content coming your way. And today I have with me a very, very special guest. Her name is Radhika Mittal. Radhika is the director and founder of Super School India, an NGO right here in India that believes in designing education solutions for India's problems. Their current focus is on a very important subject. Their current focus is on bringing sex education to under-resourced youth communities. Already, I know that some of you are thinking, ooh, sex education. Yeah, we don't really talk about it very openly. We don't talk about it with our families. And today here on FOMO No More, we're actually going to address it head on. It is an important topic and I can't wait to hear from Radhika. Welcome, Radhika.
Hi, thank you, Vrinda, for having me on FOMO No More. I'm really excited for this live.
Fabulous. So, Radhika, I'd love to just begin by understanding how you got into this field.
Okay, it's a moving story, but so where there is an anecdote attached to this, and a very moving anecdote. That anecdote was set in a larger context that we had already been operating in. So Super School India, the NGO, had already been operating for 2 years, but our focus was spoken English. And so we had a center in Delhi where kids from government schools would come after school to study spoken English with us. And 2 years into this, obviously in those 2 years when I was in India, because I had moved from Singapore to India to do this, you live in Singapore where you can step out at any time of the night and feel safe. And then to move to Delhi where at 7 p.m. you start getting calls from your parents. And this is despite sort of being privileged, having your own car. You couldn't even imagine what the average woman and female in India kind of goes through, right? So it was sort of this larger context that I had already been operating in and being a part of. And I just lost my electricity. So, it's back. Great. And then sort of this larger context was what I was operating in. And then this one anecdote happened that really pushed us to start sex education was one of our female students, all the age of 13, stopped coming to our center. And then when we found out that why she wasn't coming, and the reason was because some men were harassing her on her walk over to the school. Which, by the way, is not a rare occurrence. It's very common across India, which also is one of the main causes as to why female literacy rates are affected, which is that the walk over to the place of education itself is not safe. So, and then how did we as a society respond to this? Her parents stopped her schooling, not just her super school schooling, but her regular schooling as well. And then when I spoke to the other kids about it, and then we tried to devise a plan, what shocked me the most was that the kids blamed her. And quote unquote, their words were, दीदी अगर वो पीछे मुड़ के देखेगी, हंसेगी, तो लड़के उसको छेड़ेंगे नहीं तो क्या करेंगे? आप उसको इतना दूध धुला मत समझो. And I just couldn't believe my ears because we were here working tirelessly, getting these kids all the quality education they deserve. But we were just missing out on the very basic thing is life skills, respect, gender respect. And that's kind of what pushed us to start sex education.
Wow. So, for our global listeners, what Radhika just said was that this girl, 13-year-old girl, stopped coming to school because she was being harassed on the way to school. and the response of the community, the peers that she had, was in fact to blame the girl. That why did she even look up? Why did she even laugh? She must have done something to provoke the harassment from the men on the street. And as you rightly said, Radhika, this is not a one-off incident. This is just so common in our country.
Yeah.
And can you help us understand that when this happens to a child, what happens? What does the child go through?
When something like an incident like this, sexual harassment,
Yes.
I think we've been conditioned as children, especially as female children, to actually blame ourselves. So what happens is that in a situation like this, children start looking inward and they actually start doing self-blame, and they start looking at the fact that, yes, I must have done something to have gotten this reaction. So that's one thing that definitely happens. Two, in sort of very tangible impacts, is their education suffers, their social circle suffers, their own friends start judging them, their own friends start blaming them. So in a sense, like a cycle is created. A lot of the times what happens with students in such scenarios is that a certain reputation in the community is wrongfully created around them. Can you imagine a 13-year-old having a reputation for something that she didn't do, and for abuse that she actually went through? So what happens is that until and unless you don't kind of step in and address this, it's something that just perpetuates over the years. And that's something that we've kind of seen as well in certain cases where when we didn't have sex education, we've actually we've had some female students that were with us at the start when we didn't have sex education, where we weren't impacting our children in a very systematic way, where we were not dealing with victim blaming in a very systematic, regular intervention way. Is that particular female student that was with us right at the start, she was all of 12, and then she ended up earning this unfair reputation in the community that stayed with her. And in her case, from just speaking from a very psychological point of view, in her case, because I mean, as humans, we all want to derive worth from somewhere. And often children should derive their worth from education and care and concern. In the case of that little girl, not the girl that I spoke about at the start, but this other little girl, because she was not getting any care or concern at home, the society did not have sex education. So they couldn't make sense of the fact that what was happening to her was actually wrong. It was not her fault. Eventually, over the years, in her case, despite all the intervention that we tried to do with Childline and different NGOs, she ended up deriving sort of her worth from the abuse. And it was a horrible cycle, which eventually we had to put an end to it, where her parents were trying to get her married off into as a child bride. And then it had to be put an end to with the relevant NGOs and the police getting involved, and that had to be put a stop. So what started 5 years ago as simple victim blaming ended up psychologically impacting that female student. And eventually at like sort of 16, she was like, yeah, okay, I just want to get married off. So yeah, it's quite horrifying to know about one such story and sort of realizing that that's the story of so many girls in India.
Absolutely, absolutely. And right now you've just painted the picture of girls who have been victims of harassment or abuse. But and I know this is the work that you do. Broadly, even if a child is not abused, what is the sort of sexuality education they're getting? And what is the scenario of children learning about their bodies, learning about sex, learning about consent?
Yeah, so as a child, like you rightfully said, right? Like, what is the current scenario around learning about your body, sexuality, gender? So as children, children actually start exploring as young as 1.5 years old. They start exploring their own body and pleasure as young as 1.5, because pleasure, touching genitals, is a physiological response. It's very normal, and it can start as early as 1.5. But really understanding social structures, let's just, for the sake of this slide, let's maybe take the age of about 8 years old, 9 years old. Children start experiencing massive body changes, not just physical, but also mental. But what's happening is that something that's happening, you can't stop that. You can't stop body changes. But what's not happening alongside it is nobody's telling them or preparing them for it. So what happens with that is that a child goes through something, right? For example, maybe for a female, she sees blood in her underwear one morning, or maybe for a child who is predominantly male, they see semen in their underwear in the morning, or an erect penis, and they're just shocked. They're shocked. So what happens is that the current scenario is all these changes are happening. Nobody's preparing them, which can lead to fear, in some cases even shame. So they continue living with their shame because nobody talks to them about it. And there is another angle to the shame, especially when it comes to masturbation, touching of the genitals, is that there is pleasure attached to it. So children do feel that they're enjoying it, which is normal. But because pleasure has been so tabooed in India and many other countries, that it comes with the guilt and the shame with it. So that's level one, where we go through changes, but nobody's talking to us. Yeah. Nobody's telling children that it's normal, don't worry, sabke saath hota hai, it happens to everyone. That in itself is like such a reassurance, right? That, oh, it happens to everyone. And then on the second level is that they're still curious, right? They're still curious, not just about their own bodies, but about the bodies of other genders. They're curious about relationships, because with mental changes, some kids are going to experience attraction. So we will still want to address our curiosity. So we'll go somewhere. And the most relatable place that we can go to are oftentimes the most unreliable places. So your peers who are as clueless as you are, or the internet, which is a treasure trove of insanely good and insanely bad information. Now, what happens in India is that as a country and as a public education system, we're still struggling with sort of imparting quality spoken English to children. And the other reality at the same time is that the good information, more of the good information is available in English on the internet. India is still sort of working to create good, reliable information on sex ed in local and regional languages. Yeah. So kids go to the internet. If a kid has internet, the first thing the kid's going to do is not search for credible answers. They're going to go watch porn, right? They're going to go to chat rooms and try to figure out answers. So changes, nobody talking to them, and then they going and getting their answers from unreliable sources. So this entire ecosystem is leading to the perpetuation of the myth culture. So you have a certain curiosity, you go look for an answer at an unreliable source. The unreliable source tells you something they heard from somewhere, some chachi, some chacha, some dost, or something that's been passed around. And then it just sounds so sensational, it sort of makes sense. So then what happens is that the kids start going like, acha, ha, this is the answer. And then they go tell other people, other kids, that this is what it is. So an example I can give you is, kids are very curious to know about this one, the virginity myth. Didi they don't come to us if we don't give them sex ed. Amongst themselves, if a female has sex for the first time, she will bleed, and if she doesn't bleed, that means she's had sex before. So then they talk to each other about it, and then the other person goes, yeah, I heard this, because there is something called a seal, like as though a woman is like, a mineral water bottle. There's a seal, and then once you have sex, the seal breaks and blood comes out. Makes sense, right? Like, it's not completely outrageous. So the kids start believing it, and then the myth culture perpetuates. Now that's just one issue amongst hundreds that the children are currently surrounded with.
You've articulated the issue so beautifully and so comprehensively, Radhika. I could just go on listening to you. And you're so right. Like, all of us have been teachers, or all of us have been kids, and we've been these people. We've been the child that's been curious. We've been the child that's wanted to go looking for information, never had the courage to go and ask our parents, never had the courage to go and ask our teachers. And so, yes, we do reach out to our friends, and then we reach out to other sources like pornography in written or visual form. And I'm sure you're going to cover this somewhere in your talk about what that leads to. Like, if that is my sole source of information, what even gets created in my head about this whole experience?
Yeah.
So, at the macro level, what does this look like, and what kind of statistics are we talking about? Can you shed some light on that?
Okay, so when you multiply this by millions of children and youth, right? And India, by the way, is the country with the largest number of youth in the world. We've got 243 million youth in India. And there are no conclusive studies, but some studies point to the fact that only about 13% of 243 million youth have received some form of sex ed, not even comprehensive sex ed, some form of sex ed, right? So at the micro level, we're living with all this confusion and guilt and fear and misconceptions. At the macro level, this becomes a culture. So like I said, from like just drawing upon the whole perpetuation of the myth culture, the children and youth start believing, and it starts translating into mass action. So once a particular myth sort of starts taking hold of our psyche, we start behaving in accordance, right? So some of the stats that we are looking at over here right now is that the average age of watching porn in India is 10 years old. And by average, yeah, 10 years old, which means that there are kids younger than 10 that are watching porn. So what you're doing is essentially you're learning about how many things from porn. You're learning about sexual intimacy. But what are you learning about sexual intimacy is that it's so male focused, that there is no scope for love and the other things that are a part of sexual intimacy, talk, or things that don't look as glamorous. Suddenly, they're not learning about that. Two, they're unfortunately getting very unreasonable expectations that they would want out of their partner, right? Porn always has somebody that's dominant and somebody that's submissive, right? Which only perpetuates the existing problem in India about how women are not sexually liberated enough, how women's pleasure is never really even a concern. The number of people we've worked with, young women that we've worked with, are shocked to know that a female too can derive pleasure in a sexual act. Like they're genuinely shocked. They genuinely believe that a woman's role in sex is it's actually a duty to give sex to their partner. So from porn, you're learning all of this. Other stats also that speak to me are stats around STIs and unwanted pregnancies. India again leads the world in unwanted pregnancies. So what happens in unwanted pregnancies is, okay, fine, unwanted pregnancy happened. Chalo, theek hai. At some level, not acceptable, but we can terminate the pregnancy perhaps, right? But India, with unwanted pregnancies plus taboo around lack of sex ed, right? What that leads to then is a very high rate of risky abortions.
Right. Because they're not going to the doctor to find out how to do it.
They're not. Yeah, they're not, because they're scared, right? I mean, even if you look at India's pregnancy termination laws, they're very confusing. We often get together, people from the sector, we often get together, they're extremely confusing laws. So while it's not illegal to get an abortion for an unmarried woman, so specifically around unmarried women, the abortion laws are very vague. So what happens is that there's already taboo, there's fear. Somebody again comes and goes like, I heard from a chachi or a friend or somebody that you can go here and you can get an abortion done. And what that usually means is taking the wrong medicines, which means that the termination of the pregnancy happens, but the fetus doesn't get flushed out of the system, which has often led to death of women because the uterus gets so corrupted. Two, you end up going to quacks. They're literally omni vans in which termination of pregnancies happen. So what happens in all of this is that these stats really speak to how we just don't have anybody coming to us and talking to us about all of this. Because for everybody that's going to an unsafe place, there are also credible NGOs that are offering safe abortions. But why is it that we're still not seeing a drop in these numbers? Is because we just don't have the opportunity or the permissions to go and talk to the correct audience about the availability of these resources.
Right.
So,
and I just wanted to, chime in here that I think a lot of parents and general audience in India will be of the opinion that no, children don't need to learn about abortions. They shouldn't be having sex in the first place. If they just are sane, problem solved because there is no problem. So could you talk a little bit about, while we have this very conservative attitude about, if you abstain, that's the solution. What are the statistics on, under 18 youth actually having sex?
So the average age to engage in sexual activity in India is 14. Yeah, it's quite young, and it's only becoming younger. This average age is dropping.
Would you say this is like, is there an urban-rural divide? Is there an educated-uneducated divide? Or because these are that a lot of us hold.
Yeah. I can't speak about urban-rural, but I can speak about educated and uneducated. There's not much difference in educated or uneducated. These are stats that exist across socioeconomic levels. So, which also speaks to the fact that sex education is applicable across all socioeconomic levels. Singapore Super School has chosen to focus on under-resourced children for a reason being that we want to use our funds in a space where the target audience does not have the capability of paying for an education like this. So that's why our focus is this, but we've always maintained that sex education is a need for children of even privileged families. So when it sort of comes to like sexual activity, the reality is that it's happening, and every research year on year has proven that regular sex education actually delays the onset of the first sexual activity in any youth's life. And the reasons for that are many, right? And we've seen it in our own work. Is with sex education, children are able to understand the consequences of risky sexual activity. Before we do our workshops, we do impact. We do an analysis of where the children stand in terms of the knowledge and their opinions. And what we found in these studies was that on one side, the majority of the children and youth know what sex is. So they were able to describe that sex is the act when a penis enters a vagina. And I'm talking from a very heteronormative point of view, please excuse me. And then on the other side, we asked them, do you know how pregnancy happens? And they were not able to answer. So we got majority wrong answers. So kissing and like only a minority was able to tell us that it's because of sex. So what that goes to show is that they know what sex is. They know that there's something called pregnancy, but they don't know the link between them. And that's the majority of the students. And I'm talking about age group 13 to 21 that are completely unaware about this. So what sex education does is that it helps make these links. It helps make these links between sexual activity and STIs. It allows us to talk to students. We never scare them, but we tell them that you should be aware of all the consequences before you engage in any activity at all. It could be skiing, it could be skydiving, it could be playing soccer. You should be aware of all the consequences. And if you're ready for those consequences, then it's your decision. But these are the consequences. So oftentimes we have children, when we do our impact analysis, sort of coming to us and and sharing with their anecdotes or in their feedback forms that they had no idea that sex was this serious. It was always like a very trivial activity sort of in their minds, a very trivial word. They weren't aware of the consequences. So sex education allows you, and that's one of the reasons why sex education leads to the delay of any youth's first sexual activity.
Wow, that's very insightful. I did not know that. Thank you so much for talking to us about this. For the listeners who've just joined, you've joined a brilliant conversation with Radhika Mittal from Super School India. Their work is on bringing sex ed and quality sex ed with the right information to children in India. So, moving on, Radhika, I'd love to understand from you, what is the impact of not having sexuality education in place in our schools, in our families? Like, who does it impact? Who all does it impact? And what is the impact?
It impacts everyone, definitely. But especially females and people from our LGBTQIA community. By everyone, I mean it impacts men too. But the impact of lack of sex ed is unfortunately a lot higher in a patriarchal society on females and LGBTQIA communities. So, so that answers. Sorry, what was the second part of your question?
How does it impact, and what are the impacts that each of these stakeholders?
Okay. Well, I mean, with females, it's very relatively clear, right? Even when you look at something like contraception is a huge part of sex ed. When we talk about sex ed, we tell youth about the various forms of contraception and the pros and cons and whatnot. So in India, all the statistics point towards the fact that the burden of contraception and using contraception falls on women. So the burden to want to use contraception falls on women, right? Why? We can explore this. There are multiple reasons. Myths that float around that it's less manly to use a condom. These things that little boys sort of grow up listening and eventually they turn into men, right? That it's not mardangi enough if semen and sperm is not released. If it's captured into a condom, it's not manly enough, right? So again, the burden of wanting to use a condom falls on the woman, because the impact of not using a condom will unfortunately be borne by the woman's body, whether she sees the pregnancy to its full completion or she has to most likely go through a risky abortion. So that's one very tangible way of understanding how it impacts women, right? The other way to understand, which I think will resonate more so with the audience, is that sex education, while it focuses so much on these very clear-cut topics, contraception, pregnancy, it also talks about social constructs and our behavior towards all genders. So we try to break down all these misconceptions that unfortunately the culture has, thanks to our movie industry, thanks to decades of the same notions being passed on, right? That hasi to fasi, if you laugh, if she laughs, she's interested in you. No means yes, no means try harder. Wife bashing jokes and whatnot. We address all of that in sex education, and because we do it continuously and regularly, we're able to really impact youth's thinking. Now, in the absence of sex ed, these notions, right, that have a real impact on a woman's safety, they just continue to float around, and they continue to impact more and more young impressionable boys that eventually grow into men. So that's another thing. That's two ways how it impacts females, amongst the many ways that it impacts us. On the second hand, with the LGBTQIA communities, it's really shocking to see how absent their concerns are from our sex education curriculum. So it's almost like LGBTQIA is a plug-in topic, whereas it should be something that cuts across all our workshops, because if we think of them as a separate community, where again I said them, right? This is now something I'm trying to also alter, right? When we say them, we other. When we think of the LGBT communities as a separate community, we will never be able to include the concerns of the LGBTQ community into mainstream sex ed. So what happens is that when we don't have sex ed, which talks about LGBTQ concerns, one, little children that may be gay or lesbian or may not resonate with the sex assigned to them at birth, may have a different gender identity, they will continue to live without being able to express themselves. And that has mental health repercussions. On top of that, sex education allows us to correct children when they use words like chakka, kinnar as an insult. So we're able to talk to them about it. We're able to normalize all these different communities. So what that happens is that in the absence of sex ed, discrimination, bullying that sometimes actually leads to physical harm and violence that the LGBTQ communities have to face. Now that's also something that has a huge impact on LGBTQ community members.
Absolutely. And even men, I think, like, without quality sex ed, boys grow up with these distorted notions of what sex is supposed to look like, what they themselves are supposed to look like, their own. We don't talk nearly enough about the body image issues that boys.
Of course. I think like another thing is that in our workshops, and again, something I'm trying to course correct myself but we talk about it in our workshops for sure, is it's I think a lot of people ask me this is, do you do men bashing in your workshops?
Huh?
And I think it's sort of because I'm female. I think it's people assume that might be happening. But the reality of the situation is that we work with statistics, and we also talk about what true gender equality looks like. So we address many concerns that actually negatively impact boys and men, right? And I'll give you one example is having unreasonable expectations out of your boyfriend or your male partner.
Yeah.
So while not appreciating a certain gender role out of yourself because of my gender as a woman, but at the same time expecting your male partner to do something just because he's a male, right? Now there are certain things that are out of our hand. For example, sort of expecting a male partner to maybe accompany you back home at night. Now that's something that no woman really wants to be in a position to want. It's just unfortunately in India a reality because of safety. But then expecting the male partner to pay the bill when the female partner is also capable of paying. So these are the sort of like little nuances that we also address. We also talk to our male students about expressing their emotions. So we talk to them about the emotional part of being in a relationship. So we address those things as well. We also talk to them about toxic masculinity. We talk to them about the time when they were feeling weak and they wanted to just talk to somebody, but they had to man up. So it also allows for a space for them to share maybe about heartbreak. A lot of the times when men go through heartbreak, they just do not have the right place to sort of talk about it, to talk about their emotions. And in a sex education kind of space, what we also do is we create a safe space for youth to talk about what they went through when it comes to things to do with gender and sexuality and whatnot. So it really allows men that have otherwise been expected to adhere to these non-emotional, toxic standards of masculinity, allows them a space to just be human and to express.
And that's the need of the hour. Like, I come from the social emotional learning space where a lot of the work I do is about helping children, both genders, all genders, express their emotions, be able to express their needs, and be able to function in healthy ways in their relationships. And over again, I find that there is definitely a difference in the ability that women and men have in their ability to express their emotions, but it's not natural. It's not something they were born with. It is totally something they were conditioned with.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
I'm really glad you brought up the topic of toxic masculinity and how it relates to sex ed, because when a man feels weak, or even a boy as young as 5 feels weak, so often we tell that boy, don't cry, man up, like you said. And what does manning up mean? Manning up means maybe punching the wall, maybe breaking something, because that's how frustrated I am that I can't express that I'm feeling sad.
Yeah, yeah.
And somehow aggression, I feel so much that the aggression that we see in men is not that they want to be aggressive. It's that they don't know any other way to be human.
Yeah. And also just Bollywood celebrates aggression. So aggression is almost put on a pedestal. And I'm saying Bollywood because I tend to watch Bollywood movies more. But our pop culture celebrates aggression in men. So even though, like you said, it may not come naturally to us as when we are born, but it's almost like, that is the manly way of doing it.
So, Radhika, your organization, Super School India, is doing some phenomenal work. And I'd love for our listeners to get to know what you do and how you do it.
All right, great. So it's a relatively straightforward model. It's, in other words, like sort of academically, it's known as comprehensive sexuality education. Really depending on our audience, we sometimes tend to use softer terms so as to not scare them off. So sometimes we use gender sensitization, sometimes we use family life planning. I really don't like family life planning, but it sort of has to be used. Sometimes we use the more recognized term in India, especially in the government system, which is ARSH, Adolescents, Reproductive and Sexual Health. It's also known as SRHR. So there are a lot of different terms. So we usually stick with comprehensive sexuality education. We partner with schools or organizations or any setup that works with under-resourced youth communities. So this setup could be online, the setup could be offline. We usually tend to work with partners because we would like a set structure where we can go in and create a safe space for the students to ask us their questions. Then once a partnership is signed and agreed upon, we begin our work. We usually intervene for at least a year, and we visit the students at least once a month. And in between 2 workshops, we have a follow-up session that is led by a peer leader. So we pick students from our target group who are trained to conduct very simple activities between 2 workshops.
Okay.
So back in the middle of 2 workshops, just to keep the information fresh in the students' mind. And so that's basically our model.
Wonderful. Okay. And can you share some stories of success and also some stories that have been, challenging for you?
Well, honestly, I thought that we would have challenging stories or stories that, I would probably want to bury somewhere. But it has been a spectacular journey, which only goes to show how missing this piece of education was in our systems, right? We were expecting pushback from teachers, but we have barely gotten any pushback because after regular intervention, teachers have come and reported that the students' behavior has improved overall, not just towards the teachers, but towards cleaning staff, towards the principal, towards the canteen staff. Because another big part of sexuality education is empathy. Like we drive home the point of empathy in every workshop. So some success stories that have been, some of my favorite ones are one of our male students when he started receiving our workshops and we started sort of talking about the LGBTQIA communities. The first reaction, because he's been so conditioned by our heteronormative world, was disgust. The first reaction was, and I'll translate to English, but what's the point of being gay? So when we explored it a little more, it was like, if you're in a relationship, don't you want to make kids? But if you're gay, you're not going to be able to make kids. So what's the point? So, I think that's, yeah, so the kids were just very like, Didi, it's a little weird, when we're in the metro, we can't tell, like, is this a guy, is this a girl? Like, just very like sort of, obviously not the correct way of expressing what they're feeling. But again, sex education is also a lot about allowing children to say what they feel without judgment. So then, we heard them. We didn't scold them. We instead just tried to explain to them about identity and letting somebody be. They listened to us because they had to. Then 4 or 5 more workshops happened. And then this male student comes to us after the 5th or 6th workshop. And he shares an anecdote with us. So when he was in his mohalla, in his juggi, in his slum, and he was with his group of guy friends, the kids started saying chakka, kinnar, and they started like teasing a kid for having feminine traits. And so he kind of like intervened, and he was like, he gave them a whole lecture. Basically what he learned from Super Schools workshops, he went and told them about sex, gender, sexual orientation, and then he was just like, okay, so you guys have understood, and then like, and then he was walking home. And so this one kid from the group comes to him and says, hey, I want to tell you something. And this just blew my mind. Turns out this kid had realized that he was attracted to boys, and he had been living with it for 5 years because he was so ashamed. And when our student spoke so openly and so non-judgmentally about this, he went to our student and said, thank you so much. I want to tell you, you're the first person I've said this to, but I think I'm gay. And thank you so much for being okay about it. And, our student was just like, yeah, Dee, I was a little shocked when he said that, but I just kind of like, I was like, yeah, bro, I mean, you're still my friend. And I hear that story and I'm just like, this is so amazing, because our student came and shared with us and he was like, thanks, because I didn't know that one of my such a close friend was living with this. And I feel ashamed that for the last 5 years, we have been using his identity as an insult. And so he was able to introspect, right? So this one story like really stays with me. Another story that really stays with me is girls, when we talk to them about menstrual myths. And we try to do away with the whole, if you're having your period, you can't go to the temple and the kitchen and whatnot. And we try to do this in like a fun way with them. And we try to give them the logic about what it used to be in the yesteryears and what it became because of Chinese whispers now. And so little girls like 12 years old, 13 years old, they'll come to us and they'll be like, Dee, can we tell you something? Like, okay, sure. So, I was having my period and I touched a jar of pickle, and you know what? Nothing happened to it. And so I told my mom. And so, it's just really interesting. I'm just thankful that they didn't put a spoon of like water in it or something, because had they done that, like that would have just completely done away with my work. But yeah, so, we have many such stories, and these are anecdotes, but obviously our impact studies that are more quantitative, they kind of confirm the anecdotes. They confirm that these changes are happening. Kids are challenging their parents at home, especially about things that, they are able to challenge, like menstruation is a big thing they're challenging at home. A lot of the times we have our male students that come to us and they tell us that, hey, I have a crush on this person, or I have a crush on that person. And then, we're just listening. We're like, okay, what are you going to do about it? No, after the workshop, I kind of feel that, yeah, there's a time and place for everything. And right now, I think my 12th boards are more important. So, maybe I won't pursue this. Or if somebody comes to us and says, I told her I like her and she said no. And so I said, okay, cool. Sure. And then I backed off. And so, they're retaining this information and they're applying it to their real life. And that's it's absolutely beautiful, right? Another male student came to us and told us how a girl in class likes him. And, this is our own unconditioning that we have to do. Because my first reaction, which I didn't give, but in my mind, I was like, oh, But then I thought about it. Had a female student come and said the same thing to me, my first reaction may have been concern. Like, are you okay? Do you don't want those advances? So I stopped myself and I asked him, I was like, and then you're telling me because? And he's like, because I don't like it. I don't like that she comes and she tries to pull my shirt and she, hits my head. And I really had to uncondition myself because my first reaction, obviously, in my mind was like, oh, so cute. Wrong. So I heard him out. The team heard him out. And, we told him that, listen, if you want us to intervene, let us know. We'll come. We'll come to your school. We'll get the parents of the kids together. We'll talk to the girl first. But, maybe you can also tell her in straight words that you're not interested. And so I think it's very important. But what was beautiful was that this kid knew that he could come to us and tell us this. Because in an otherwise toxic male world, it's almost like, why do you have such a problem? A girl likes you.
Yeah,
suck it up. And I'm just glad that he came to us. I'm just glad that he came and he shared his emotions and we were able to tell him that his emotions are valid and that he should back off. The correct thing is for her to back off. You don't need to do anything.
Right. And this is where I think the conversation of consent can begin.
Yeah, absolutely. We talk about how consent is needed everywhere. That's something we reiterate, especially in our all girls institutions, is that it's a two-way street. You got to understand consent, you got to demand for consent, and you got to respect your partner's consent. So don't think that men always want it, and don't get offended if your male partner doesn't want it in that moment. So I think these are topics that we have. Obviously, consent is as easy as it sounds once you understand it. It's actually a very difficult concept to explain to children. So we have to use analogies. And so we have our different fun ways of sort of talking about consent in our workshops. And it usually ends up working by the end of our intervention.
Wow. It is incredible to me that we've almost completed our hour together. So over the next few minutes, it would be so great to hear what is next for your organization, Radhika.
I think first thing would obviously be to continuously improve ourselves. Like definitely continuously look at all the feedback we're getting, not just from our target audience, but from our facilitators, from our funders. Take what we need to and reject what we know will not work for the program. So that's one, continuously improving ourselves. Two, obviously with COVID around and COVID having really pushed us to think about how we do things, we're definitely looking at a tech angle for our work, and we're thinking about how we can reach our target audience through the medium of tech. And as we go forward, really, so the school's goal is to work with states and to work with getting sex education as part of a curriculum, like compulsory part of the curriculum. And honestly, the ideal situation would be if sex education is a subject that actually has a test that is marked. So it's taken more seriously, not just by students, but as with society. Right now, even if sex education is an offering that an NGO comes and does in a school, it's almost like extra on top of academics, right? In the pillar of priorities, it doesn't really feature. But when it's a subject, right, in a subject that is marked, it's given priority. It's seen with a more serious light, more serious lens. So that's obviously like a bigger, further future. But in the near future, we want to work with governments. We want to be able to reach out to the maximum number of children, and working with governments is definitely a way to do that.
And I know that you have a program through which our listeners and anybody who's interested and who cares about children getting sex ed can contribute. I know that you're welcoming donations. Would you want to talk a little bit about that?
Definitely. Thanks so much for bringing that up, Vrinda. So we've done a calculation, and it costs us as an NGO about 1,000 rupees to educate one child for an entire year. So what that means is that we will have a touch point with each student 8 times a year minimum. Additional on top of that, there will be visits by health professionals, so gynecologists, urologists, pediatricians, that will visit the children and address their concerns, and youth communities. And then on top of that, we also conduct impact assessment studies, and we also provide an avenue for the students to ask anonymous questions and to have their questions answered. So when anybody contributes and supports the education, sex education of children, it allows our team to be able to go into different communities and deliver our modules to the children.
Wow, wow, absolutely. And it's phenomenal that you do all of that in 1,000 rupees per child.
Yeah. I mean, it works on the economies of scale. So we do need to have a school that agrees to letting us work with at least 300 children. The 1,000 rupee figure works when we are able to sort of work with a minimum of 300 kids in every venue.
Wow. So I'm going to add the link for sponsoring a child's sex ed in the chat box right here. And for anyone who's interested and wants to do it, it's amazing. I can't think of anyone better than Radhika and her organization to do this work. So please do consider contributing. And lastly, Radhika, what is one thing that you'd like to leave our listeners with? Like one message for our listeners?
I think it would be understanding and practicing consent in every aspect of your life, right? Be it with your children, friends, romantic partner, colleagues. The reason why I'm saying this is because understanding what consent is and practicing it's revolutionary, because this one simple change can address so many concerns, right? So when we talk to our children about consent, and when we practice consent with them, we may be able to avoid potential child sexual abuse. When we talk about consent, we may be able to prevent sexual crimes, right? There are sexual crimes and that happen between people that know each other, between partners. We're able to avoid instances like the recent boys' locker room, right, where photos were shared without the consent of the person whose photo it is, right? Something as simple as what I'm trying to do in my own life as well is, before I upload a photo from a night out with friends, I ask every single person who's in that photo that, are you okay if I upload this photo? Whenever we post anything on Super School, right, even if it's a simple image of a volunteer teaching a child, we not only take consent of the child's parent, and the consent is to show the photo that, hey, we're going to upload this. This is what you're consenting to with this caption. We also ask the volunteer, because we recognize that a volunteer, although an adult, is still an individual whose consent is important. So what consent does is, when you start practicing consent in even like these so-called minute things, you'll start seeing how boys' locker room and sharing those images was just horrific. So consent is this one tiny thing that has just massive positive impacts in almost all aspects of our life: work, personal, home, everywhere.
Absolutely, absolutely. I'm so glad that you mentioned that, and I love how you mentioned that it's in the tiniest of things. It's in asking people permission before posting a picture, and I think it helps in creating safe spaces all around us. So beautiful, beautiful. Thank you so much, Radhika. It has been such a delight talking to you and hearing from you these nuances of a topic we rarely talk about. So thank you so much for coming with us here on fomonomore tonight. And for everyone who joined, please share your thoughts, any comments that you have in the chat box right here. And do join in again for more content right here on fomonomore.
Thank you so much, Vrinda. It's been my pleasure.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.